Okay, let's get started. We have about 30 people in the room, so I think we can start the session. Hi everyone, my name is Zachary Gersten, and I'm the session manager for Innovative Approaches B, and the session is chaired by Damakolo Chovik. Thank you all for taking part in the ANH Academy Week. We look forward to a robust and interactive session. A quick reminder that everything that you might need to access the conference materials and programs, they can be found on our website, which is anh-academy.org/ANH2020. So before Damakolo takes the conversation forward, just a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth and as interactive as possible. So first, the session will be recorded and posted on the ANH website, so you'll be able to access the recording and review it as you want. Second, you can probably see, but all the participants have been muted. We do want you to introduce yourself in the chat box, tell us where you're from, your name, of course, where you're from, what institution you're from. It's really great to get to know you all. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you want to share your webcam, that would be great, but we understand there might be bandwidth issues and that would require you to keep it off. You can put a profile picture on there so we can still see your face in case you want to do that. Later on in the session, we'll have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the chat box. We'll be able to take those questions and then feed them to the session chair, Namakolo, and ask them to all of the presenters. If we have time, we might ask you all to raise your hands. You can do that using Zoom. So you can, if you want to say your question out loud. If you experience any technical issues, do let us know. We advise you first to just check your audio settings, check your internet connection. You can always leave the Zoom call and then pop right back in using the exact same link and password. That sometimes it just needs to reset itself and reconnect in that way. But again, if you have any technical questions, please let me know using a private chat. So without further ado, I think we can move forward. I'm going to hand it over to Namakolo.
Yes, thank you. Welcome everybody to this session on innovations. This session will focus on a number of items with respect to diets. And specifically, we will look at diet quality, affordability of a nutritious diet, looking at profiling food safety, and also looking at assessing global food quality. And then, so what I would like to do is first go directly to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Anna Herforth of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in the US. And she's going to talk about the development of a low-burden diet quality questionnaire for measuring dietary diversity and other indicators of diet quality across different countries. Anna? You're welcome. Please proceed.
Thank you, Namakolo. Nice to be here. And now let me go ahead and share my slides. Great. So yes, just to recap on the recorded presentation, which I know some people probably had the opportunity to see, and others may have been busy. So to give a quick recap, this is the work that I'm presenting is about the development of a low burden diet quality questionnaire for measuring diet diversity and other indicators of healthy diets across countries. And basically the main work was doing cognitive testing of this low burden tool to gather food group information. And this involved asking different versions of the questions and interviewing respondents about what they were thinking about when they heard the question. And this is an example shown in this slide of some different formulations of the same question. And what we found in brief is that in this version A, shown here, which has an open-ended question asking people to self-categorize foods that they may have eaten during the day that belong with the others that we mentioned, we found that people sometimes miscategorized foods, such as in the green leafy vegetable category, including cabbage, which we would not prefer to include there. And so this could lead to overestimates when asking this type of question. And we found that people had an easier time cognitively with version B here, which is a closed-ended question asking about specific foods. And we also found that this version B captured the vast majority of people consuming the food group. So the end product here is a parsimonious and low burden way to ask these food group questions in a consistent way across efforts. So this has implications for MDDW as one application, because many different efforts are collecting MDDW data, the minimum diet diversity score for women, as one indicator of diet quality. And the current way it is collected often uses open-ended questions, but not always. And some of the open-ended question formations are shown here in the current adaptation examples. And we recommend, based on this, the results of cognitive testing, to use sentinel foods. So these, foods that are highly consumed and capture the majority of the population, to avoid people thinking of, for example, foods like oranges when asking about fruits that are dark yellow or orange inside, like mango or papaya, that, we want something specific that is not necessarily how people think of it. And we also see a lot of different efforts collecting questions in very different ways, such as, quite long questions. I just want to point out another minor result that we found. So for the second question shown on dairy, when we asked to exclude things like, tell us, did you eat food XYZ, but not including butter, ice cream, or sour cream, we found people actually asking about the opposite, or sorry, responding about the opposite, where they would actually hear the end of the question and tell us whether they consumed butter, ice cream, or cream when we wanted them to exclude that. So we found a way of, just asking about these key sentinel foods to simplify the question, get better information, and also that it captures most people. So we, ended up with this diet quality questionnaire, which has 28 different items, each a food group. It takes less than 5 minutes to administer, and it can be used not only for MDDW, but other healthy diet indicators related to NCD protection. So it includes, items like sweets and sugar sweetened beverages and other foods beyond the MDDW. So this provides a way to ask questions in the same way over time, across contexts for comparable information. It's a survey module tool that's suitable for use in whole or in part in multi-topic surveys, such as the Gallup World Poll, where we partnered to develop it, and the DHS, other national surveys, and agriculture projects that aim to collect diet quality information. So the next step here is that we're working hard on identifying the sentinel foods in each country contexts, and ultimately we aim to provide these adapted diet quality questionnaire tools for each country publicly available. So watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We will definitely watch the space. Those who collect dietary data know how hard it can be and how long it can actually take. So that takes us to the next presentation, which is going to be done by Kate Schneider. And Kate Schneider is going to present on household diet quality and the cost of a nutritious diet in Malawi. Recognizing that measuring diet quality is one thing, but making that diet affordable can be a deal breaker, really, in that if people can't afford the diet, even if it's good, it won't work. So Kate Schneider from Tufts University, please go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thank you, Namakolo. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everyone. I'm not going to share any slides. I hope you do have a chance to watch the video, if not before now, perhaps after the session. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of our study where we looked at household diet quality and the cost of nutritious diets for families, whole households in rural Malawi. And to do this, we used a unique combination of household survey data, retail food market prices, and a relatively new food composition table that's specific to Malawi. And we first assessed the adequacy of current diets relative to household needs, and we defined those household needs in a way that accounts for the reality that households eat common meals together, families share food. So our first major finding is that diets are really imbalanced in macronutrients. They're skewed towards carbohydrates with inadequate consumption or insufficient nutrient density in terms of protein and fats. With respect to micronutrients, we found that the 4 nutrients most likely to be inadequately consumed in diets are B12, riboflavin, lipids, and selenium. And then we used linear programming to calculate what a least cost nutritionally adequate diet would cost for these households. So we observed that their current consumption is not nutritionally adequate. It doesn't have all the nutrients needed for optimal growth and long-term health in the proportions required for that family meal. But we find that an adequate diet would cost about 1.5 times the median household's current food spending, and about all of total spending. So that means that on average, about 50% of rural Malawian households couldn't actually afford this shared adequate diet and stay within their current food budgets. And so then we next explore what's driving this cost. Why is it so high? And we look at the specific nutrients that are the most expensive to obtain within the food system. And we find really interestingly that riboflavin is by far the most expensive nutrient in the food system. A 1% increase in a household's requirement for riboflavin translates to a 325% increase in the total cost of that family's diet. And in dollar terms, in 2011 purchasing power parity dollars, this is about $2.33. And that amount is about equivalent to the per capita cost of the adequate diet. And so in other words, a 1% increase in riboflavin requirements is as if, in budget terms, you added a whole additional person to the household. We find that B12 is the next most expensive nutrient, but it's far behind riboflavin. It only leads to a 28% increase in the diet cost for a 1% increase in B12 requirements. So the most immediate policy implication coming out of this research is these diets are not affordable. Households in Malawi can't afford sufficient nutrients at the current availability and prices. And we also find that for some households in certain markets and months, an adequate diet that meets the shared household needs is not even available. And so our next research questions then are, what are the specific policy options that exist to address these constraints? And so our next steps are going to be modeling policy scenarios that are focused on increasing access to and reducing the cost, focused on specifically those limiting nutrients that we observed, so riboflavin, B12, protein, lipids. And then we'll be able to determine which would be the most effective policy options to bring down the total diet cost and increase the affordability of a nutritionally adequate diet for families in rural Malawi.
Thank you very much, Kate. And thanks also for keeping to time. Before we move on to the next speaker, I just want to remind the participant that you can put your questions in the chat box, and we are monitoring the chat box. And so at the end, we will be picking out questions that have come in the chat box. Our next speaker is going to talk about the framework for food safety assessment for livestock-derived food retailers in selected low and middle income areas of Nairobi. And this is an additional important aspect of dietary quality. And our speaker is Maria Gaza, and she is coming to us from, there's no institution given on my list. Maria,
Sorry.
maybe you can give us your institution as you speak, please.
Yes, so I'm from the Royal Veterinary College in London. Yes. So thank you, Namukolo. So yes, I'm gonna present the framework, a framework we developed for food safety assessment of retailers selling livestock-derived foods, and we applied it in low and middle income areas in Nairobi. And this work was really in response of a lack of effective policies to assess food safety, and also tools, prioritization tools and risk-based tools to address the problem of food safety in different food systems, especially in livestock-derived food, for livestock-derived food. So with this framework that we propose is basically to rate food safety characteristics of retailers and be able to obtain risk profiles that can inform decision making. So this process is based on risk assessment principles, considering hazards and also the exposure to risk factors and mitigation measures, and is really conceived as a rating system similar to other food hygiene rating systems found in other countries. And so this was applied in low and middle income areas in Nairobi. And how we conceive this is that we develop criteria that could consider aspects of the retailer, such as the product characteristics and also retailer environments, such as the sourcing activities, the infrastructure, equipment, and practices. And then for each of these sections, we develop different criteria, combining characteristics and conditions that should be met to achieve different ratings, from being very optimal and achieving a rate of very good to being really deficient and achieving a very poor rating. And so this was applied into field data from Nairobi using a cross-sectional survey with retailers in peri-urban and informal settlement that also was informed by other qualitative data with different stakeholders to understand obviously the contextual situation and what is higher risk or lower risk. And so basically the final output or the end product that we aim to obtain is a risk profile of the retailers. This is just a selection of 3 of them, just basically to illustrate how this is aiming to be an informative tool for especially for stakeholders, for decision makers that can use this type of data. So basically being specific on the different sections and the different points of assessment of the retailer. And so this can be used for researchers to be able to obviously address certain products or certain areas that should be, especially in these settings where there is a lack of data on risks, on microbiological hazards, but also for policymakers and for authorities that can maybe design risk-based surveillance or also improve existing policies and interventions. So yeah, so this is it. Thank you very much. For more information, you can watch it in the website.
Thank you very much, Maria. So food safety is indeed important, and it's important to look at profiles that can inform how we can address food safety issues. Our next speaker is Sabri Bromaj, and he is also with Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And he's going to speak to us about developing a global diet quality score, a novel food-based metric of diet quality. Bromaj, please proceed with your presentation.
Thanks, Namukolo. for the introduction. So very happy to be with you all here today. So just to kind of summarize the motivation for this project that I was working on, there is no sort of overall global standard indicator for assessing and tracking overall diet quality. So my colleagues and I, we wanted to create such an indicator that was A, easy to operationalize, meaning it doesn't require food composition data to calculate. B, it can be applied to diets from all over the world. And C, it's sensitive to dimensions of both under and over nutrition at the same time. So we did this by developing what we call the Global Diet Quality Score, which is an entirely food-based metric consisting of 25 different food groups that we consider to be globally important contributors to nutrient intake or non-communicable disease risk globally. And basically the way that the metric works is you get points for eating more of healthy food groups, you lose points for eating more of unhealthy food groups. And this is based on a simple trichotomous system for classifying the mass of each food group that you consume. And then you basically sum up all of the points to get your overall score. And we validated and refined this metric in an extensive secondary analysis in which we recreated the metric using a food frequency questionnaire and 24-hour recall data, or measurements rather, contained in cross-sectional and cohort data sets from Africa, China, India, Mexico, and the US. And we analyzed how the metric scores that we recreated in this fashion were associated with different health outcomes across the different regions. And overall, we found that the metric is quite sensitive to nutrient adequacy, anthropometry, and other clinical measurements, and also non-communicable disease risk across different countries. We also found that the metric performs as well or better in general than the Alternative Healthy Eating Index and the minimum dietary diversity score for women. So this is very encouraging. And based on these results, we're planning to launch the metric around the end of the year. We're also developing an app-based instrument for primary data collection of the metric, which will also showcase at the launch. And briefly, the way that this instrument works is it's a simplified open 24-hour recall that automatically classifies foods that you report to metric food groups using an onboard global food database. And this is combined with a 3D model-based portion size assessment that we use to assign point values to each of those food groups and compute the total score using an algorithm that we validated in our secondary analysis. So that's the basic idea. I'll end there and happy to discuss in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabri. Indeed, it's actually, I like the fact that it includes negative components of the diet as well. So we move on now to our question and answer sessions. There are a number of questions that have come up already. The first question from Celia Gonzalez is on what are the cultural food preferences implications in increasing access to a more adequate nutritious diet when thinking of your next policy question? I'd like to direct this question, I think, to Anna Herforth first.
Thank you. And I actually think that Kate would have inputs here as well related to her presentation. But we do work on that project, the overall project on affordability of nutritious diets together. And I think that there is some overlap in terms of, you know, what I was discussing here on the most commonly consumed foods, and also, you know, increasing access to those foods across food groups in terms of affordability. So, you know, we can look into understanding in each country, in each nutritionally important food group, what are the common foods that are preferred. And then in the work that Kate discussed on affordability, seeing, you know, are those foods accessible and what are the relative prices of those foods, because there may be culturally preferred foods in certain food groups, particularly the nutrient-dense perishable ones, the fruits and vegetables, the animal source foods, which we have, access food price data to show that they're actually not very affordable. So that would give us a lead into, how to start the discussion with policymakers in terms of ways to increase access and affordability to those items in specific countries.
And Kate, could you perhaps address the issue of policy instruments? Are there any examples of policy instruments that you're aware of that can help with accessibility of more nutritious diets?
Sure, and I think I'll also speak to the first part of the question about preferences. To say that the way that we calculate these least cost diets, it's meant to be an economic metric against which we can compare household incomes and food spending. It's not meant to develop a recommended diet. There are similar tools that are out there, Save the Children's Cost of the Diet tool and the OptiFood tool, which was developed by LSTHM. Those impose additional constraints around palatability and cultural preferences that are meant to develop an actual recommended diet for low-income consumers or vulnerable populations or whomever they're targeting. In our case, it's simply to meet nutrient adequacy. And so these are not meant to be palatable or culturally acceptable diets. It's meant to give us a costing benchmark against which to evaluate how well the food system is able to provide access to all those nutrients. But then when it comes to policy scenarios that could affect the affordability of that diet, they would target specific food value chains, or some of them would target specific food value chains, in which case the question of are these foods that are culturally acceptable and appropriate does become very relevant. And so just to give you an idea of the first two that we're considering is what if there were a percentage shift in the price of eggs across the board. And so one scenario that we're going to model is a 10 or 15 or 20% reduction in all markets and months, whatever is the observed price, just a percentage reduction in the cost of eggs. And eggs are not terribly widely consumed, but they are acceptable and palatable, but they're seen as expensive. And so I think people who have done field work, which is not part of our study, have shown that people would eat eggs if they could, or if they felt like they could afford them. And then the other one is milk, and in particular powdered milk. It's a very good source of riboflavin, and there is no supply chain or seasonality reason why it couldn't be available in all markets and months. I think there's a trade story about powdered milk in Malawi that I'm trying to learn more about. So if anybody has experience with that value chain in particular, and some of the trade with South Africa and the discussion around a potential factory in Malawi, please message me. I would love to learn about that. So those are two of the policy scenarios that we're thinking about.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. The next question is from Sylvia Allion, and she's directing her question to Anna. So Anna, are the Sentinel foods identified to represent year-round consumption, or do you need to adjust the Sentinel foods for seasonality? Anna?
Thank you. That's a great question. In doing the Sentinel food selection, we validated this using existing secondary data, so we could actually look at the frequency of food items consumed in 2 countries where we had national level data, but in most countries we don't. So we actually depend a lot on key informant interviews and desk reviews to identify the most important Sentinel foods. And as a part of that work and those interviews, we do ensure that we ask people to consider all seasons, because we want this tool to be usable at any time of year. So going back to the mango and papaya question example, the questionnaire might be administered during mango season, or it might not. And that's an item that is highly seasonal. So given that we don't know what time of year the questionnaire might be implemented, we always want to include items that might be commonly consumed in any season. And if the questionnaire is asked in a time that's not mango season, then people would simply say, no, they didn't consume that item. So we include considerations for seasonality in the selection of the foods.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Barbara Hazler, and she directs her question to both Kate and Sabri. So Sabri, I'm going to ask you to address it first. So the question is, when you conceptualized quality in your studies, did you include food safety risks, i.e. adjust quality for higher and lower food safety risks? Sabri, you first.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. And so we considered it. I mean, ultimately, when we were developing this metric, we recognize that diet quality is quite a multidimensional concept, including not just nutrition, but also food safety and also environmental concerns, impact on planetary health. We focus mostly on the strictly nutrition terms in terms of over and under nutrition, with the interests of making a more focused and sort of parsimonious food list and the simplest sort of scoring system that we could come up with that was still sensitive to nutritional aspects of the diet. That being said, we did consider specific concerns in creating the scoring method. So for example, when it comes to fish, let's say, we considered concerns around toxins in fish, and we sort of weighed these against the nutritional risk, and we made kind of a net sort of nutritional score for each food component when we implemented it in the overall scoring system. But yeah, again, our main sort of concern was strictly the influence on undernutrition, so micronutrient adequacy specifically, and overnutrition, not non-communicable disease risk, as the main sort of defining outcomes that we're targeting.
And Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that in our case, again, I would just reiterate, these are not meant to be recommended diets. So something like food safety is not something that this particular study is taking into account. That being said, we look at a 1 month observation of food prices, and there is an implication that foods would be storable, and that raises food safety concerns given low storage opportunities. But yeah, I think I would say that food safety is not something that we have considered, so we didn't adjust the nutritional content of any of the foods to consider food safety.
Thank you. The next question is from Jose Manguina, and it is directed to Maria. In relation to meat, shouldn't home management be registered too? For instance, if it is utilized or not refrigerated cooking facilities and that kind of stuff, I presume it is if people are selling food from their homes, shouldn't they be registered as well? Maria?
Yes, thank you very much for your question, actually. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And it is definitely how the food is managed at home, and it is a point to mitigating any risk coming from the purchasing place, from the retailers, or from where the food has been acquired. However, in this study, we only focused on the retailer point as point to, yeah, basically as a way where, maybe policymakers could have a play, but obviously, and as a way also to eventually this can inform other decisions, and it's just basically a point where risk can be spread. But yeah, definitely. There was another part, I must say, of the work that was looking at the consumer side of things. So this was the retailer part, and then there was a complementary consumer part of how these foods are acquired and then managed at home. But yeah, we just decided to develop a tool just as an informative tool from retailers. But yeah, it is a really good point to also base interventions on education and how consumers should handle potential risks.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from Elise Tausma, and it's on overlap between tools. And she directs her question to both Anna and Sabri, and she asks you to discuss the relation and maybe overlap and differences between your two tools. I don't know who wants to go first. Anna, can you go first?
Sure, yeah. Sabri and I have discussed this, and I'm sure he'll have more to say. Essentially, at this point, the diet quality questionnaire is focused on collecting data referring to the last 24 hours. And the GDQS that Sabri described is more focused right now on using food frequency questionnaire data collection. So they're different tools in that way. The DQQ can, I think someone else asked a question I'll try to address here too, that the diet diversity scores can be calculated out of the DQQ, as can other scores. So we've been working on a suite of indicators that can come out of the DQQ on adherence to global dietary recommendations, such as on fruits and vegetable consumption, legume consumption, fiber, also avoiding processed meats, excessive sugar in the diet, excessive saturated fat. All of these indicators we've been working on can come from the information in the DQQ. Actually, at ANH Academy last year, I presented on some of the indicators, so they sort of go together. And I think there is potential in the future for the GDQS to be adapted to be able to be collected through the DQQ, but that's a future research agenda.
But does the score that you're using also, does it give any negative points to sugary and fatty foods or anything like that?
Well, the DQQ is a tool that can be used to create a variety of scores, a variety of indicators, right? So certainly, so actually the food groups that we collected are quite well aligned with the food groups that Sabri was talking about. And some of the indicators, which have been developed to go along with the DQQ, do similarly give, negative points to things like sugar sweetened beverages and things like processed meats, which are not recommended or, recommended to limit in the diet. So, the DQQ is a tool to get information on whether people are consuming food groups. And from that, you can create scores that give positive points to the healthier food groups and negative points to the food groups which are associated with negative health outcomes. So I think there's a lot of possibility for, for metrics to come from this tool.
Okay, thank you. And Sabri, do you have maybe some additional points on the overlap?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. And as Anna mentioned, we have actually discussed this in quite a lot of detail. I think Anna hit on most of the points. I agree with basically everything she said. The food lists actually are quite similar. They're not exactly similar, but the foods that the DQQ includes, there is a strong overlap with the GDQS, as she mentioned. The other issue she mentioned is the sort of, I guess, reference period that the DQQ considers based on a 24-hour recall sort of period is a bit different from what we kind of envisioned for the standard scoring system that we've implemented for the GDQS. But there is potential to adapt the GQS to that. And despite the sort of guidance that we accompany with our metric at the launch, people will inevitably sort of tailor their own data collection or their own analysis to sort of fit, what they think works. So, we've envisioned this, and in the future, as Anna mentioned, I think there is a potential, but we'll have to work on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. The next question is, Anna, you have a lot of questions. The next question is directed to Anna, and it's coming from Julia Pastori. And the question is, I have a question about the evaluation of dietary diversity from the questionnaire. Are you planning to create a score based on the WDDS food groups, or create a new score? And which are other aspects of the quality of the diet that can be investigated? Anna?
That was the question that I was thinking of from Julia, which I sort of tried to address in the last comment. So to go a little further on that, when she's asking about the WDDS, the Women's Diet Diversity Score, yes, that was a key aim. In choosing the 28 food groups included in this questionnaire, we wanted to ensure that we could use it to generate diet diversity scores for women, and then using those same 10 food groups for the wider population. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, we have simultaneously been developing a suite of other indicators, given that diet diversity only reflects one aspect of the diet, which is nutrient adequacy and general diversity among food groups. We wanted a suite of indicators to more fully reflect diet quality in different aspects. So, for example, there are many different fruits and vegetable questions among those 28 food groups, and those can be used to generate a score predicting whether the person has met the 400-gram target for adequate fruits and vegetables, using diversity of consumption as sort of a proxy for quantity, which actually seems to work well. So we have work coming out on indicators related to individual pieces of diet quality, fruits and vegetables, free sugars, saturated fats, fiber, and individual food groups. So all of this can be used to understand different pieces of the diet, and then again, maybe in the future we'll work towards a total score that sort of sums up all of them together, but that's to be continued.
Thank you. And the next question is directed to Kate. You mentioned copper upper levels being a binding constraint. Which foods are particularly high in copper?
Thanks. I think there are actually a cascade of a couple of questions about copper, and it's really fascinating, copper and zinc. So I think just specifically to answer Anna's question, yes, I found copper is a binding constraint at the upper end, which means that the diet is hitting its upper limits on copper before enough foods have been included that meet all of the other minimum requirements for other nutrients. And so if you allowed more copper into the diet cost would go down, and 1% change in that upper limit of copper, moving it up just a bit, would decrease about 140%. So about half the cost of increasing a riboflavin requirement would be increasing the upper bound on copper. And I think those two nutrients are found together in one particular food that may be driving this. So I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that the food list has 51 items for which we have prices. So those are the only foods that can be selected into this diet, and that's a limitation. And I'm happy to talk about alternatives and other ways you could formulate this. But for now, what we have are these retail market food prices that are consistent across the country. So it has a lot of advantages too. And beef liver is that one key food, which may also be expensive. And so, I can't say if it would get selected into the diet if it didn't have so much copper, but it also has so much riboflavin. And so it's one of the key sources of riboflavin. So I think that particular food may be part of the story of both of those nutrients. Other nutrients or other foods that are really high in copper are tomatoes and cabbage and a lot of the plant-based foods, because a lot of evidence has shown that Malawi soils are very high in copper, and soil copper enters into the food. Not all minerals enter and remain in the food, but soil selenium and soil copper have a strong influence on the mineral composition of food groups grown in foods grown in those soils. And so I think that's part of the story. And then one other thing I wanted to say to the other questions that asked about zinc and phytate content. First of all, we did include an assumption when we assessed adequacy that the diet has low bioavailability of zinc. But when we compute these least cost diets, we make no adjustments because they are assumed to be, they are defined as adequate. And so we don't account for the potential nutrient interactions. But I think that I can't remember who made that comment, but you're right. And another thing to say is that the micronutrient survey that was carried out in Malawi in 2016 found a higher prevalence of zinc inadequacy than our dietary assessment would have suggested. So when we looked at just at what people ate, we concluded that people were consuming more zinc than their zinc status was actually showing from the biomarkers. Now, I know one of the posters yesterday actually took a bit of issue with the method that was used to calculate that in the micronutrient survey, and they recalculated it, and they found the probability of zinc inadequacy to be slightly lower than what had appeared in that study. But still, I think it's all to say that people may be consuming more zinc in Malawi in their diets than their bodies are able to absorb, and had the high copper content of other foods and the high phytate content both possibly explain that, and it does complicate the assumptions that we make when we calculate these least cost diets. But again, they're not meant to be recommended diets. It's meant to be an economic metric against which we can assess affordability.
Thank you very much. And the next question is to Maria, and this question was preloaded. The person doesn't indicate a name. Were the risk profile ratings communicated to the retailers? Did they mention barriers or opportunities they personally faced based on the risk profile that was presented to them, if this was the case? Maria?
Yes, thank you for the question. This information, it hasn't been communicated to the retailers. The way that the information was collected, it was as a survey to characterize retailers and practices. So this wasn't the aim when the retailers were informed to use this data this way. However, the team did conduct interviews, and part of the questionnaire was on barriers found, and so some information previous to the designing the questionnaires coming from the focus group discussions were indicating already barriers for lack of compliance of retailers with the policies or with the licenses for food safety, for food hygiene, for medical licenses, for certain infrastructure, and so on. And so this was already collected by different stakeholders, and then this was also translated into constructs, and definitely different retailers highlighted different things. And for example, one of the things was the lack of capital to be able to invest on the infrastructure, and this is noticeable in most of the results from the profiles, that there is big weaknesses in what is the infrastructure, and for example, access to water and access to, and it's open air, and this is informal businesses. So there is a lot of information that will be interesting to link to this, definitely to the interpretation of the profiles, and be able to come back to it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is targets Kate, and the person indicates that the assumption that each member eats, sorry, I need to scroll down. The person indicates that the assumption that each member eats in proportion to their own energy needs is a big one. As we've seen from other research, do you think there is scope for weighing certain calculations based on the normal eating patterns of a specific population in the instrument that you suggest?
That's a great question, and something that I and collaborators have grappled with a lot. And the way that we've actually tackled this for time and simplicity, I'm only telling this one end of the story of what happens if we make an assumption that the family, everybody eats the same meal and everyone has their energy needs met, and that requires a high level of nutrient density. The alternative way to think about that in adequacy would be to calculate with adult meal equivalents, but that makes the same assumption that everyone is getting a proportion of the family food, dividing foods over people that is in proportion to their needs, or to collect intra-household data and actually observe family food sharing, which is really difficult to do. And then in terms of defining the cost, we can what I've shared is the cost of that adequate diet if everyone shares that food. And then the alternative is, okay, what if each individual just had a tailored meal that met their own individual needs? And that could be a lower bound on the cost. And we've calculated that as well as a way to say, here are two scenarios that give us an estimate of the cost. Neither of these scenarios address that issue of intra-household allocation. And I think I come back again to the point that these are meant to be defined in a way that would be adequate. And so meeting your nutrient needs is equitable and adequate. It's not meant to reflect how households actually eat for the cost, for the least cost diets. I think addressing the adequacy question is separate and probably warrants a longer conversation. But for these least cost diets, what we want to say is, assuming that everyone did have their needs met, which is what we all hope for, here is how we can estimate what that would cost and whether or not it's affordable.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that totally answered your question, but.
This question is from Anne-Marie Mayer, and it's addressed to anyone, it says. Does anyone have any advice for self-administered surveys, such as by mobile phone app that people could use themselves to record diets? Anyone pick it up? Anna, maybe you.
Yeah, I think, Anne-Marie raised a question that's really huge. I mean, it's a whole area of research and work on how to collect diet quality information. So what I presented was one way to do that that is fit for purpose within agriculture surveys or multi-topic surveys, where you have an enumerator who's not necessarily a nutritionist trying to gather some information very quickly to say something useful about diet quality. So that was the central purpose for which the tool I described is based, and what we tried to do with it. There are many purposes for collecting diet quality information at different levels of depth, quantitative information versus, low burden indicators, and different specificity. Are you interested in food groups, or are you interested in indigenous wild foods that might be adding important micronutrients in small amounts to the diet? So these are very different purposes for which you might want to design diet quality data collection tools. And there's tremendous promise in mobile phone apps and what those could do. But I think you've hit on an area where there's a lot of development that could happen for different purposes of what you want from the data.
And then I'll take a last question directed at Kate. Are there plans to repeat this type of research in other countries or regions, since results will be quite specific to different places and diets? Kate?
Absolutely. And I'm only one collaborator in a relatively large team. Anna is another collaborator, and she has been working on some of these studies, and they don't all just do nutrient adequacy. We also, in our project, have a least cost diet of meeting dietary diversity recommendations or food-based dietary guidelines, which is what Anna's been working on. So other countries that our collaborators have been working on are Tanzania and Ghana and Ethiopia. And I know another one of our collaborators is on the call who's been working with data from India. So we are doing this in several countries, and then other collaborators have done global analyses using food prices that are available for all countries or most countries in the world. And so I think there's some ongoing studies looking at the global affordability. Our colleague Robel Olemu worked on one that I believe has already been published for every country for which there were food price data. So yes, it's definitely country specific in terms of results, but it's also very useful to look across countries.
If I could just quickly add to that, there's some work, as Kate mentioned, on our team that for the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2020, which is coming out in less than 2 weeks on July 13th. There is an analysis in that report that we've done on first the indicator Kate talked about, the cost of nutrient adequacy, and second, the cost of recommended diets across 170 countries in the world. So that will be coming soon for cross-country comparisons. Keep an eye out on July 13th.
Oh, that's great. So now I would like to give the panelists a chance to give your last 30-second message for people to take home with them. You've spoken about a lot of things. I mean, instruments that make it a bit easier to collect diet quality data, instruments that allow people that are not necessarily nutrition experts to be involved, profiling for food safety, cost of a nutritious diet. Based on the discussions that have ensued, what would be your one take-home message that you want the participants to go home with, perhaps to go and look again at your presentation? Any take-home message that we can actually think of? If I can start with you, Sabri. Take-home message.
Thanks, Namakola. So, yeah, I would say that I'm kind of like looking forward to the next few years, because it seems like recently there has been a big push toward expanding global dietary data in terms of sort of regional representativeness, and also the quality and some innovative technological advancements. So that's very exciting. And I would say that I guess the work that we've been discussing here around diet quality, affordability, and the sort of, I guess you could say, multi-dimensional takes on diet kind of goes hand in hand with that, in that the collection of conventional or technologically assisted dietary assessment, open-ended assessment, FFQ 24-hour recall, kind of can be used to inform the diet quality measurement. And also the diet quality measurement provides obviously a sort of a whole is the bigger than the sum of its parts sort of perspective. And I think both of those initiatives kind of going forward together will benefit one another and are very exciting. So not to say that one sort of replaces one another, and that I think we have a lot to look forward to over the next few years. And very grateful to hear about some of this and be a part of this today.
Thank you. Maria, your take-home message for us?
Thank you. Yeah, so for me, I guess that it would be to highlight the need of more information, more evidence, and more systematic ways of collecting data. And I mean, and I see all the number of indicators and tools for nutrition, and there's not much for food safety to actually collect systematic data and be able to use these assessments to inform policy. So I think that's a very important thing, but even more important, I suppose, that it would be to integrate this or to be able to include it into ongoing assessments and different metrics, definitely, and see how this could be not just for livestock-derived foods, but also for other hazards that are present in other foods as well, macrobiological hazards and food safety hazards. So that would be something that definitely has been in discussions in the recent years, and there's been some work, but I would be very interested to see how this is gonna progress.
Thank you.
Yes.
And Anna, your quick take-home message for us.
Thanks. I would just like to highlight that when you're trying to get information on diet quality, different ways of asking questions will result in different information. And so I see here in this community on agriculture and nutrition, a lot of research that uses diet diversity scores to gather diet quality information. So 2 take-homes there. Number 1, I hope that the way we've worked on the questions in the diet quality questionnaire will be useful for everyone who is collecting diet diversity information in terms of a consistent and reliable way to capture that information. Number 2, diet diversity is not the only metric of diet quality. And as you heard from Sabri, and also from the work that I've been doing with the whole team on the Global Diet Quality Project around what can come from the DQQ, further indicators of diet quality are actively being worked on to accompany diet diversity scores to provide fuller information on diet quality. Thanks.
Thank you. And then lastly, Kate, your take-home message for us so we can afford a nutritious diet.
Thanks. I think I actually would love to just give a take-home message about the whole session and some of the things that I've heard from the other presenters as well. I think, you know, we all are aiming to provide useful, simple, cost-effective, low-burden information tools that can be used to work towards more accessible, affordable, nutritious diets year-round. And I think all of the innovative metrics that we've seen today, I think really aim to achieve those goals of simple and can be regularly collected at a low cost, at a low burden to respondents. And that's something that's really important to me. And, you know, when I am looking at the whole food system, I'm using regularly collected food price data, but I'm also using household survey data, and those are an enormous burden on respondents, a huge gift to the information that we can gain from them. But I think that everybody here, we're aiming to kind of develop this suite of things that we can use to better get a pulse and develop better policy options in order to improve the situation. And so I think that's my biggest takeaway from all these presentations, that we need tools that give us better quality information, but they have to be low cost, able to be regularly collected, and low burden.
So that's a nice message to stop on. We are going home with a suite of tools that we can go and consider for our work. I encourage all the participants to revisit the videos and the abstracts again, and happy use of the tools that you've been exposed to today. And thank you very much to the panelists, Kate, Sabri, Maria, Anna. Thank you very much for your hard work, and thank you also to all the participants that have come to join the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We'll close the session. Up next, we'll have a break next, and then a few different options for people to connect. The African Nutrition Society is holding a social chat. Imana Fellowships has a Q&A. And then Talia is going to take us on a tour of her farm. So we encourage you all to join those social events. And thank you, Namakolo, for chairing the session. We'll see you at another ANH event. Thanks.
Thank you.